Failure is an integral step on the path to success. At their inception, memory limitations prevented video game developers from creating a linear experience akin to a book or a movie. Flip a page and it typically stays flipped. But early video games didn't have enough memory to create a book out of its screens. Were the player to only have unique experiences throughout the runtime, they would really only see a few screens before reaching the end. Thus, the fail state was born. Sending the player back to the start not only defined the win condition, but effectively turned only a handful of unique experiences into a full game. Play the game Pitfall and you might feel like you're on a long, arduous adventure through the jungle, but most players rarely see beyond the second screen before being thrown back to the start. For the player, this incentivizes perfection, and clearly defines a win state that can make them feel good having overcome a challenge. For the developer, this stretches a small number of assets into a full game, a win-win. Super Mario Bros. Might be the most famous case of this in action. Despite featuring only 32 levels, Mario Bros. Stands the test of time because of its efficient use of content. Play once and you may not even make it past the first level. Play again and you might hit 1-2. Again and you'll fight Bowser. Keep trying and failing and you might even find yourself discovering shortcuts, mastering the controls, and saving the princess. Still, there's something a bit lacking about this as an immersive loop. While you might start Mario imagining yourself in the shoes of this mustachioed plumber, repeated restarts show just how gamey the process really is. Players who do overcome the obstacles are likely doing so out of memory, and repeating the process over and over can make the piece feel artificial. In other words, the more you repeat, the more it becomes a game. This is a real impediment to narrative storytelling, but curbed punishment with modern technology eased the burden. Full restarts become checkpoints, and checkpoints become room restarts. Compare Zelda 1, which returns players to the beginning upon death, to Ocarina of Time's Save Owls, and you'll see how more complicated narrative demands fewer restarts, fundamentally changing the flow of the game. Unfortunately, the demand for complex narrative continues to outpace available technology. All of Mario 1's art could be created on a single PC's pixel design software, but a single asset of a modern game requires design, modeling, texturing, placement, and playtesting to ensure both cohesion and stability. Demon's Souls is one of the most influential games of the 2000s, and its strained development is probably the reason why. Made on a small budget and with a limited team, Demon's Souls reintroduces the punishing fail state to extend each level's runtime. For example, the first stage outside Balataria's gates has players run through only a few tight corridors, fighting some enemies, avoiding dragons, finding items, discovering shortcuts, and, eventually, opening the gate to the boss. In a more lenient game, this stage could be beaten in a few minutes, but most players might spend a few hours on this introduction alone. Enemies deal a lot of damage on the way to the end, and even with the few shortcuts connecting the start to the end, every inch of unfamiliar progress can feel terrifying, not knowing what could suddenly send you right back to the start. For players, eventually overcoming the challenge feels incredibly rewarding. For the developers, ensuring players spend a lot of time around the same assets gives the impression of more while having to do less. It's a win-win. Nowadays, we call this fail state, and the act of running back to the place you left off, the runback. While the combat may be rewarding, the act of playing a Souls game can sometimes be slow and tedious. Characters have a realistic weight that heightens suspense and makes combat meaningful, but it can be a bit sluggish and hard to control. Combat's high-risk and high-reward dynamic can make even the smallest encounter engaging, but players returning to a stage are incentivized to avoid most enemies and run to the end of the stage. A first run-through might have the player fearing restart akin to a horror element, but every other run, especially when trying to reach the boss again, will feel much more like a nuisance. Perhaps we can learn something from Mario. If you think about it, Mario is just one big runback, so why don't we get annoyed? It might be quite simple. It's not the goal that's motivating the player, it's the mere act of playing. Something about controlling Mario, running fast, weaving through obstacles, and feeling the flow is the thing actually motivating the player to continue. The rest is just icing. This section of Hollow Knight Silksong, the long-awaited sequel to the Souls-inspired Metroidvania Hollow Knight, illustrates this dynamic in what might be the most memorable part of the game. Hollow Knight copied the slower movement from Dark Souls to build an oppressive atmosphere with the exception of one move, the pogo. In that game, the knight could keep mid-air momentum with a bouncing downward slash, which, paired with a quick dash in the air, created a unique versatility. Unfortunately, many of the more difficult applications of this system were reserved for post-game gauntlets, leaving most of this potential unactualized. Silksong not only brings this platforming to the forefront, it also changes the movement to prioritize flow. Hornet's moveset is similar to the Knight's, but a diagonal spike and a tight air dash adds complexity to the movement. Even when the player replaces their diagonal spike with a more conventional pogo, the level design has been geared towards a constant flow of motion and mid-air acrobatics. This section on the blasted steps and the preceding boss are gatekeepers, ensuring that the player has mastered both the platforming and the combat before the game's more difficult second half. From the bench, players must guide Hornet across a dangerous gap, jump across deadly pits, bounce off bells, wall jump, and fight big and small enemies without losing too much health for the boss fight. Any slip-up costs the player greatly for the difficult fight ahead. There's only one combat upgrade before, no movement upgrades, and no bench by the boss. The only way forward is through. Every death puts players back on the bench, demanding another run back through the gauntlet. This would be hell given its length if not for the mechanics, which are both rewarding to streamline and open for mastery. My first run was quite slow, but after a few tries, I started to consider new ways to streamline. Many of the platforms can be ignored. Well-timed wall jumps put you in the right placement for the next section, and pogo jumping on enemies can launch Hornet into the bell above, skipping the tougher bits while replenishing some silk for healing. The runback becomes a game of optimization, and looking for those optimizations is just another opportunity to keep moving the character. This might be the best lesson we take from Silksong. Player action is a pure source of enjoyment, and making the mere act of control not an obstacle, but a pleasure, can redeem even the most monotonous gameplay. Consider these other cases. Metal Gear Solid 5 players ignore the repetitive base invasions because the stealth mechanics are so smooth. Monkey Ball's frustrating levels are fun to master because of the physics, and Tetris doesn't require any context to draw players in. In other words, purely enjoying the input mechanics, independent of context, is the fastest way to find enjoyment in a game. If a player simply enjoys playing, developers can ramp the challenge, hoping that even the lowest skilled players will try it out, simply because they want to. In fact, a game worth playing for the enjoyable mechanics might be enjoyable independent of progress. Younger players who enjoy Silksong's movement might not even fight a single boss, and despite their lack of measurable progress, might judge the game very highly. We can imagine a player who never beats the boss after this platforming gauntlet and, despite this, keeps coming back to try, merely because they enjoy the runback. Making the act of playing enjoyable could ensure that the game is fun irrespective of how far the player gets, which necessarily means that the game is more enjoyable than one that depends on progress for motivation. You're not always progressing, but you are always playing. Even so, no solution is perfect. Prioritizing player input can de-emphasize narrative context, as the player might begin to realize that the gaminess of it all is their real interest. Additionally, level design built for outlandish motion can sacrifice realism. It's admittedly a little weird that a dictatorial citadel enslaving impoverished pilgrims is built like a jungle gym. Still, it's worth it to keep trying in pursuit of a sweet spot. Just as we wouldn't want to explore a boring world, we also don't want to suffer through an interesting story. Trying out new mechanics, innovating, and exploring the ways that we engage with art is the real joy in creation, even if it means we have to keep trying and failing, again and again, and again, and again. And again.